Hello friends, my confirmation friends, welcome to this confirmation instructional video. We are up to chapter 4 in our book Manna and Mercy, and so that is what we will review today and kind of flesh out a little bit. So thank you for joining me in this time. I hope everything's going well so far. Of course, you can always just email me asking with any questions that you have, and I would be happy to respond and to answer them. So last time, you will remember that the people left Egypt, were freed from Egypt to travel through the wilderness on their way to the promised land, but as you remember, they are about to have 40 years of wilderness instruction. God freed the former slaves from Egypt and from the Pharaoh's way, and from that society where slavery was commonplace, where there were a few big deals at the top and lots of little deals on the bottom, where the little deals supported the manna hoarding ways of the big deals. God hated that. God heard the people when the people cried out to God for help. And so God appointed a leadership for them and led them from slavery. They arrive in the wilderness where God decides to teach them a whole new generation of people, but a way to live differently from the way they lived in Pharaoh's Egypt, a way that was guided by manna sharing. And so it was a teachable moment in the wilderness, and God decided to begin the lessons by showing people that life is for manna sharing. Life is for sharing the gifts of God so that none have too much and nobody has too little. And God, of course, taught them the gift of Sabbath. The Sabbath gift in the wilderness, which nurtures a life of friendship with God, friendship with others, and friendship with nature. Life is not about creating bigger and bigger manna piles, but indeed about friendship. And our daily work is nothing more than helping to make sure that God's gifts in creation get to those who need them. Well, God was leading the people towards the promised land where they could eventually live everything that they've learned and become a very different kind of community and a very different kind of society than the world had yet seen. The land, God thought, would be the manna that the people could share. It would also be manna that could be shared for the benefit of everyone in the community. But God worried, what if, when the people got to the land, they just turned it back into Pharaoh's Egypt? How am I going to stop that from happening despite all the good lessons that I'm teaching them in the wilderness? And then God had a great idea. God decided that God would bind God's self to the people in a covenant relationship. Now, the covenant relationship in the Bible is kind of like it's the kind of relationship where both sides make promises to each other, right? When you enter into a covenant with somebody, there are promises on both sides of the relationship. For God's part, God promised to be the people's God and bless them by providing all that they needed. God said, I will be your God. That's my promise. I promise to be faithful to you and never to leave you. Now, what the people promised in return was a little bit different. The people promised to respond by pledging to live the way of life outlined in the Torah, or the way, the center of which is the 10 Commandments. So God says, I will bless you, I will be your God, I will be faithful to you, and in return, live the way that I will outline for you. Now you'll remember that God created human beings in God's image in order to create safe places for all living things. That is God's fundamental work in creation. And when God created human beings in God's image, that became human beings, fundamental work, to create safe places for all living things. Egypt was not a safe place for all living things, so God got them out of there. But God wanted to create a people and a society in a land that would provide safe spaces for all living things, where manna would be distributed equitably, where the people would enjoy friendship with one another, friendship with God, and friendship with nature. God thought the best way to achieve this was to entering into a covenant relationship with the people. That covenant was first established near the bottom of their wilderness journeying here. So this is always hard to do in a mirror image like I've got in the camera here. Okay, so they started in Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea here, they wandered down here, they were taught some of the lessons of the wilderness about manna sharing down here somewhere, as we outlined last week. And then when they get to the bottom here, they come to a very special mountain. And it's called Mount Sinai usually, but it's also called Horeb. It can also be called Horeb in the Bible, same place. And it's down there. And this is where the covenant was first made between God and the people, right there at Mount Sinai. So your book, Manna and Mercy, does a great job of outlining that day for you. I won't repeat that, but I will say that in the middle of that great day, the center of that day was, Moses went up the mountain, spoke with God, and then came down with a gift for the people. And as you remember from many children's messages, God had a beautiful gift, gave a beautiful gift bag to Moses and said, here's a gift for the people, take it on down. And you'll remember that that gift consisted of 2 stone tablets on which there was writing, and there were what we call the 10 Commandments sometimes, the Decalogue, the 10 words. That's a Latin way of saying the 10 words. The book calls it the Decalogue. We call it the 10 Commandments sometimes. And here they are. 2 tablets. There were really 2 parts to the covenant relationship one, right? The first one, the first 3 commandments have to do with the people's relationship with God. I am your God. Use my name lovingly. Take time to worship me. Time on the Sabbath day. You have time on the Sabbath day? Take that time to nurture your relationship with me. Use my name lovingly. I am your God. So the first 3 really had to do with the people's relationship with God. The last 7 had to do with the people's relationship to one another, right? Families are to love each other. Do not kill. Husbands and wives love each other. Do not steal, right? Don't take manna that's not yours. God will provide you with enough. Speak well of other people. Be content with what you have. Again, don't go wanting somebody else's manna. Enjoy and honor the people in your life. These were not rules for the people to follow in order to get into heaven. That is absolutely not what they are. These rules are for this life. These rules are for our world. This gift is for ensuring that people can live safely together, that life can flourish in society. Sometimes I say, imagine what would happen if there were no traffic laws, right? A lot of people would die. A lot of people would get injured. Laws are meant to protect life and to ensure that life can flourish, and it is just exactly the same with the 10 Commandments, with the Decalogue. This was a great gift, not a burden, but a great gift given to the people so that when they entered the promised land, life could flourish. There was a bit of a blip in the story. Moses came down the mountain to find the people worshiping a golden calf that they had made with all of their, with all the gold and jewelry they had brought with themselves from Egypt. But of course, Moses was very angry, smashed the tablets, eventually got God to forgive the people and make some new tablets and brought them back down. After that great ceremony and the covenant making was done, Moses continued to teach the people in the wilderness about the ways of manna living. And so he taught them many, many more lessons about what it meant to be a people of manna sharing before they got to the promised land to live what they had learned. So the book outlines a few things that Moses taught the people, some of the bigger things. Wilderness school continued, we call this. So one of the things Moses taught the people was about the tithe, or a tenth. So a tenth of all that they had or owned. Most people would have a portion of the land when they got to the promised land that they would grow crops on. So a tenth of the food that they grew, or the money that they received in exchange for the food that they grew, a tenth of that, once a year they were to take a tenth of whatever they'd earned for that year and have a big feast and have a big party and enjoy it. Enjoy the fruits of the land. Enjoy each other. Party with one another and just celebrate being God's people and this amazing society that God was leading them to be. Every third year, they were to use that tenth to give to the poor and the vulnerable among them, so that they too would be able to feast and celebrate being God's people. Another thing they were taught was to leave part of their crops for travelers and for the poor. So they weren't supposed to, if they had a fence or whatever of where their land was, they weren't supposed to take all of the crop right up to the fence. They were supposed to leave some beside the fence. They weren't supposed to, if stuff grew back, if crops grew back in the same year, they weren't supposed to go out and harvest that. They were to leave that for the poor and for travelers. If some of the harvest was dropped in the field before they got it back home, they were to just leave that there for travelers and for the poor, so that they would have something. It was another way of sharing the manna. And then, of course, Moses continued to teach them about the Sabbath, for instance, and the great gift of the Sabbath. You will remember that the Sabbath was a seventh day when the people were to rest from work, right? Every seventh day on the Sabbath day, just as God had rested on the seventh day from the work of creation, the people were to rest from work on the seventh day so that they could focus on other things. As we learned last time, they were to focus on reminding themselves that life is not about accumulating manna so they could take a day off. Life is actually about friendship. Friendship with God, friendship with others, and friendship with nature. Well, after the covenant-making ceremony, Moses expanded the teaching of Sabbath and taught that there were three parts to keeping Sabbath. One was the Sabbath day, which we just talked about, nurturing friendship with God, friendship with others, and friendship with nature. A second part had to do with the Sabbath year. So once every 7 years, they were to observe the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year was a year in which the land was to rest. They could eat whatever produce came off the land just naturally, but they weren't to work at it. They were to rest for a year, and the land was to rest for a year. Farmers have continued to do this up until contemporary times. They call it leaving the fields fallow so that the land has a chance to rest. In the Sabbath year, slaves were to be freed. So if you went into debt and lost your land and had no way to support yourself, you might sell yourself into slavery, which was the absolute last resort of thing that you would do. But in order to prevent their society becoming like Pharaoh's Egypt, where people were lifelong slaves and generational slaves, every 7 years in this society, slaves were to be freed, and they were to be supported in making a new life. So that's pretty amazing, the gift of the Sabbath year. And animals, too, were to rest in the Sabbath year. Every 50 years, okay, so this is once every 7 days. This is once every 7 years. This is once every 7 times 7 years, right? 7 times 7 is 49. So on the 50th year of the cycle, it was a grand Jubilee year. And the grand Sabbath or grand Jubilee year was something that was really intended for the people, so that they would not recreate Pharaoh's Egypt in their land. Now, oh, I didn't bring my other map. Hang on. Hold that thought. I forgot my map. Everything was going so well here. 1 minute. I could have paused that, but hey, this is kind of fun. Okay, here's my map of eventually what would become the Promised Land. So they're not there yet, but what is going to happen eventually, as you will see, the land will be divided among the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And the 12 tribes were descended from the 12 sons of Jacob way back when. Well, each tribe would get an allotment of land. The bigger tribes would get more land, and the smaller tribes would get less land, so that, you know, in terms of the population, everybody would have more or less the same amount of land. Now, what could happen is that the portion of land that somebody was given, if they went into debt, they might have to sell their land. Now, as I've said before, if you had to sell your land in the ancient world, you basically had nothing. Your land was where your wealth was. In Pharaoh's Egypt, you know, very few people owned land. Most people had no land and were either very poorly paid workers or slaves. God did not want that to happen in this society. So every 50 years, if you lost your land through debt or whatever, through bad luck or whatever, every 50 years, the original allotment of land would go back to its original owner or its original family. And that way, everybody would start out again with more or less the same. Wealth could never accumulate in the hands of a very few people. So the Grand Jubilee year was the great reset, when there would be land redistribution. So that was the 3 parts of the Sabbath that Moses taught the people, about the Sabbath day, the Sabbath year, and the Grand Sabbath or Jubilee year every 50 years. Finally, God wondered how the people could continue to do this year after year, century after century. How could the people remain focused on being the people God was calling them and nurturing them to be? And eventually God settled on the gift of worship. God gave the gift of worship to the people. And worship would nurture the people in both righteousness, in following the way, the proper way in which a society can flourish, focused on the 10 Commandments and all the outlines for manna and mercy living. So righteousness was that, and mercy, the gift of compassion, love. How can you bring these 2 things together? Good rules, notions, ways for living together, combining them with the gift of compassion and love. God decided to do this through the gift of worship. Through worship, worship empowered the people to live and act as God lives and acts, both in righteousness and in mercy. In righteousness, people would follow the words of the covenant gift, which describes a just way of living together. So they would practice both justice and mercy, which is practicing compassion towards the most vulnerable in society. Worship reinforced both of these things and really formed the people into being the people God had imagined long ago. Worship works the same way for us. It incorporates us into God's life, where righteousness and mercy are fundamental values that we have as people together. And so worship became exceedingly important and quite rich and varied throughout Old Testament times, but it was founded on this notion. And this way, once the people got to the land, They would become the people God had envisioned that they would be way back. Remember when God called Abraham in Genesis 12. God would bless Abraham and his descendants, and in this way would invite the people to pass blessing on to all of their neighbors. And this is how God is imagining life is still going to work in the Promised Land once the people get there. They will share the gift of their way of life. They'll share their gifts of manna, whether that is land or their wealth or whatever it is, for the benefit of everybody in the world. Well, it's a grand dream that God has. We are moving closer and closer towards graduation day, when the people will enter the Promised Land and begin to live everything that they've learned in wilderness school. We are going to get to that next time. So, thank you for doing the reading this week. Thank you for doing the readings in the Bible, which I think you will find so interesting. We don't often hear some of the portions of the Bible that I've assigned to you in worship, so it's kind of refreshing. Take the lessons of Wilderness School to heart. I will talk more about how our own worship incorporates us into God's life of righteousness and mercy at another time. But for now, just keep in mind that worship functions the same way for us as it did for them. It continually forms us into the people God calls us to be, and reinforces the values that are close to God's heart. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. I will send out an assignment again next Monday. Until then, keep well, stay safe. I love you, I miss you, and I will see you next time.